Welcome everybody, and well done to those of you in person who've braved the cold to come here tonight. It might be an exercise in environmental action of a sort, and welcome to all of you who are joining online as well. I'm Hitan Shah, I'm Chief Executive here at the British Academy. We are the National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. And tonight's event is part of our Living with the Planet season, and there's a whole series of public events that we're doing on this theme. And it locks in also to a whole tranche of policy work that we've been doing in this space as well. I won't be talking about that tonight, but if you're interested, do look on our website. There's a whole series of reports that we've done in this space, and in fact one of our speakers has been involved in some of that, which you might hear about a little bit more. But as we come to the end of COP30 in Brazil, we just thought it would be really timely to be thinking about what is the role of the public, of communities in responding to environmental change. And there was some recent data from the Office for National Statistics. They did this fieldwork only in the last month or two, and it was really interesting. Climate and environment is in the sort of top 7 issues that the public say is facing the UK. So it's not completely dropped off because of things like cost of living and so on. 84% of adults said that they have made changes in their lives to try and improve the environment or respond to environmental issues. But I thought it was really interesting if you drill into the 16% who say they have not made changes. They said, well, they were asked, why have you not done anything? And they said gave three reasons. One is large polluters ought to do something before I do. That the changes I make won't have any effect anyway, and it will cost too much. So it's really interesting, I think, to drill into, well, what are some of the barriers to action? And more generally, I mean, I don't know if you're feeling this, but it's easy to feel despondent about geopolitics at the moment, and environment very much wrapped it within that. The 1.5 degree target feels increasingly like it's just sort of out of reach now. And anecdotally, but I've got a friend who's been a kind of green activist for a very long time who's now said, sod it, I'm flying again. It's too late, I might as well enjoy myself. And there is an interesting thing there, I think, about paralysis and a sense of hopelessness and what that leads to. So what I'm hoping for tonight is a kind of hard-headed but positive and perhaps optimistic at times conversation about the role that we can all play in responding to the environment. So we've got this fantastic panel. Professor Nick Pidgeon, who's a fellow of the British Academy, and that's really hard to do. There's only 1,700 fellows, and he's Professor of Environmental Psychology and Risk at Cardiff University. Rachel Cox-Coon, who's Director of Climate Guide, and she's a doctoral researcher at Lancaster University looking at the effects of political ideology in democratic engagement with climate policy. She's only 10 days away from submitting her PhD, so we really ought to thank her for taking time out to be with us tonight. And finally, but last but not least, Scarlett Westbrook, who's a leading climate justice activist and journalist. Amongst many other things, she's been a lead organizer of the British School Climate Strikes, and really looking forward to hearing your perspective as well. So in terms of the format, I mean, what I love about this Ask the Experts format, you go to so many events where the panels sit around talking to each other the whole evening, and then the chair turns to the audience, one person asks a question which is too long-winded, and then we're all out of time. We did away with all the rest, and we just answer your question. It's like Gardener's Question Time, but more fun, I think, although that's maybe controversial in this room. So we've got a whole series of pre-submitted questions from audience members. We'll start off with some of those, and I've tried to cluster them so that they kind of make a bit of sense. And then once we've done a few of those, we'll come to you, including the online audience, for anything you want to ask. We'll run till 7:45, that'll be a kind of absolute latest, and then afterwards there is a bar next door where you're very welcome to continue the conversation. So let's open up now. I mean, the first set of questions that came about were all about how do we combat that sense of climate anxiety and how do we elicit agency? Scarlett, you did a lot of work around climate strikes. I mean, what's your experience of this, and what do you think about anxiety stopping us from acting, and what are the best ways of getting people to act?
I think that it's really important to understand that climate anxiety has been really engineered by fossil fuel companies. So the first time that most of us hear about climate change in school is probably when we're calculating our carbon footprint. I know that for me, that was probably the first time I ever came across the concept of climate change in year 2, age 6, having to like calculate how much carbon I'd used on my way to school or like in my fridge, that sort of thing. And that concept was created by BP, as in British Petroleum, one of the leading polluters in the world. And they did that because they wanted to shift the narrative, shift the blame away from fossil fuel companies onto ordinary consumers. Because if you feel scared about something, if you feel responsible about something, you're less likely to want to do something about it because of that shame and guilt. And they knew that, and that's why they popularized that idea. And I'm not saying that we're like indoctrinated by schools because of fossil fuel companies, but you know, the reason that mechanism became so popular is because they funded and pumped so much money into it because they understood how much weight and gravitas it would have. So I think the first thing is understanding that this isn't a problem that we personally made. It's a problem that was made by corporate greed, essentially. It was made by people, but not us. It was made by corporations. So it's firstly separate ourselves from that and to not like take on personal guilt. I think that's the most like disarming thing that we possibly could have. So that's like the first sort of thing there. And I really do think that with anything, action is the antidote. It's a way to feel hopeful. With the climate crisis, it's so easy to feel like there's nothing that you can do about it when we know that, you know, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions, and certain countries dominate emissions. You know, it feels like anything that you do as an individual is completely useless. And it is true that you're not going to be able to save the planet by yourself. But I don't think that we can firstly understate how important it is to like build support and community within ourselves. That's how we have climate resilience, right? Like when a natural disaster happens, the only way we're going to get through that is if we rely on each other, and you have to build those networks, those systems, that support now. That's one thing. And a second thing is that if everybody acted, we actually would be able to create meaningful change. Because, you know, small ripples like make big waves, like really sort of stereotypical statements like that. But I think one thing, if I could stress one thing, because I feel like you've heard all the other arguments, is that community is so powerful. Like especially now in the political climate we're in, where we're trying to, you know, find a common enemy and unite around that instead. I think what we should be doing instead is uniting around the fact that we all like love each other, hopefully, and the planet, and that we all like have a stake in the future, and we should be supporting each other to make that future as best as possible, instead of like trying to compete for who can get there the fastest, or like in the best car or most expensive house.
It's a very warm vision, quite a different one to the one we tend to hear. Rachel, what's your view on this kind of agenda?
Yeah, for a long time I worked in Bristol for an organisation called the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and if any of you know Bristol, you know it's quite a vibrant city and quite sort of forward-thinking on these issues. But there's a particular subway that I used to cycle through on my way to work, and at the end there was a massive piece of graffiti that was quite sort of geometric, and across the middle in huge letters it says "Relentless Optimism." And I loved that, and after a few years you could buy it on a mug. And my boss had the Relentless Optimism mug, and I think that that summed up a lot of what we did. And I think that that's really important, because I think one of the most dangerous groups out there are the people that I call climate doomerists. The kind of, well, a bit like your friend, well, we're all doomed, we're going to hell in a handcart, so I may as well fly. And I think that one of the things that you can do to reduce climate anxiety, particularly if, like me, you've been working in this for a long time, is look back to where we were and how bad the predictions were 15 years ago when we were looking at potential, you know, the IPCC reports, I think it was the assessment report 4, which had the potential kind of worst case outcomes up at sort of 8 to 10 degrees global warming. And now, I mean, that would have been existentially bad for humanity. And we are still looking at parts of the world becoming largely uninhabitable if we are hitting, you know, 3 to 4 degrees rise. But we, you know, that trajectory has been bent down. We have achieved things. And it is really easy, I think, to feel completely hopeless and to feel like it's getting worse. But actually, in a very strange way, we have already made it better. And I think things like the Paris Agreement and all those things are great. But when you become too fixated on the 1.5 degrees and, oh, we're going to miss it, it's a bit like saying I'm going to fail my A-levels and I won't get to university and I won't get to do that degree I wanted to do, so nothing else is worth bothering with. But maybe there's a different degree and maybe you'll be just as happy and maybe you can make it work, you know. So it's the same. If we don't hit 1.5 degrees but we do hit 1.6, if we don't hit 2 degrees but we do hit 2.4, all of those are better than 4. You know, so giving up is the worst thing we can do. And I think anxiety, to my mind, comes from targets are great, but if you don't hit a target and the target has become what you're obsessed with, that in itself then is a cause of climate anxiety.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, in your point about positive examples, because today's session isn't just about climate, it's about all of environmental issues. You know, the ozone layer is another fantastic example of where, you know, there was a real change that we were able to collectively put together, which did have a real impact. Nick, you think about all of these issues a lot. What's your perspective on anxiety and agency?
Thank you, yes. I would agree actually with Scarlett. Well, actually both of you, but particularly the networks and communities. So, and the Academy has talked about a people-centered approach to climate action, and that sort of sums it up. But it's, as a psychologist, I might upset my colleagues by saying it's not just about the individual, it's about the individual within communities and then the organizations and systems that sit around them. And it's changing some of those that actually will be quite important. A bit of technical jargon in the behavior change literature, we talk about upstream, midstream, and downstream interventions. And the downstream, if you think about smoking, downstream intervention would be telling the smoker it's a bad thing. A midstream would be making it more difficult to get hold of cigarettes, so all the changes we've seen in retail to stop children and other groups. And then upstream is regulation, which had to happen with smoking. And smoking is a really good success story, and we should look at some of these examples for climate, of how all those things were done over quite a long period of time. And a number of interventions came together, and as each one was tested and the ones that worked were put into place, smoking rates came down. So I'll just make that's a positive thing. Now the slightly negative thing is, of course, we've been doing work on climate beliefs for a long time, and we know that most people think climate change is real. There's a small caveat about politics, which we will get onto, and it's very important. It's a very open research question currently, which we don't have the full answers to. But they think often it won't affect them personally, and as well, potentially it might be more severe in other countries, other parts of the world, which is probably in some respects correct. But climate anxiety is something slightly different. So it hadn't been studied up until quite recently. But now there have been a few studies looking at it from a slightly more clinical perspective. So it's asking the question, you know, was your sleep disrupted, would be a good example, as a result of worrying about climate change. Of course, I guess most people in the room would say, well, no, that's not the case. Mine certainly isn't. So some people, and particularly some young people as well, are experiencing actual either symptoms or intrusive thoughts around the issue of climate change. But it's a much smaller proportion than the majority of us who think climate change is an important thing. We have to do stuff about it. So I'll come back to networks and community, because as a psychologist, one of the ways you would approach somebody is through, I hate to call it counselling, it's not counselling, but it's kind of others giving you support and advice and saying there are things that we can do about the problem. And again, I'll stop, because I could then go on and say a lot of things about how many levers can we as individuals pull and how many levers sit in the hands of large organizations like government, like corporations. And a lot of them sit elsewhere, which is where the lack of agency comes from. So alongside the community, the one thing I would say is, we know in the UK that we have, and we are making good progress on decarbonising electricity. It's been a huge success for the UK. It has some issues to get, and I'm not even sure we'll get to 100% decarbonised electricity, and maybe that's not necessarily where we want to go, but we'll get very close. And if you consider 30 years ago, most of our electricity was generated through coal and some gas, then that's an incredible change that has happened. So you can see, and that's one of the things, if somebody says to you, a young person says to you, well, nobody's doing anything, that's an example. There's so many other things we have to do, but that is an example of where, you know, people in that mid and upstream level, i.e. government and businesses, have put their heads together and have, you know, made these huge investments to start changing that part of the energy system. So there are things happening. There are lots of other things that aren't happening. Flying is one of the big ones. Agriculture is another big one as well, that we could have a longer discussion about. But yeah, so community and getting the right levers at the right level.
Thank you. And I think it's a really good theme that's come up about, you know, what is the actual relevant role for individuals and communities versus businesses, governments and others, and we might come back to that. Actually, didn't have that many questions in advance, but I'm sure you as an audience will turn to that in due course. But the next cluster of questions we had were about how we get people more engaged and involved. And Rachel, I wondered whether we might start with you, because in a sense this has been you've been looking at this with a very particular lens, and wondered if you might tell us a little bit more before you submit your PhD, in case we've got any last minute feedback for you.
So one of the things that most of you will have heard about that's really increased in the last 5 years or so is the use of citizens' assemblies for making policy decisions on a whole range of things, but particularly on climate. And we've had, astonishingly, we've had around 50 climate assemblies in the UK, including the national ones for the UK and for Scotland, and then a whole host of local ones. And I think my views on that they partly lead into a wider concern that I have, and it's partly why I did the PhD in this area, is that there's almost a sort of blind spot in people when they get involved in things like that. It's a particular type of person that really promotes that kind of thing, and, you know, very crudely put, they would tend to have left-leaning worldviews, which would mean that sort of more participation equals more democracy sounds like a good idea. And what my research has shown is that actually conservatives, for example, are considerably less likely to sign up for a citizens' assembly, which is unexpected because actually their civic engagement tends to be higher than supporters of most other parties. Whereas Reform UK voters would have a very high intention to participate in a climate assembly, but for a different motivation, because they would want to be there to represent the point of view that climate change is bunkum, basically. And that's fine, because that means you'll have those different worldviews in the room, but it means it's extremely important, I think, to make sure that when we're recruiting for citizens' assemblies, that we're not, if we haven't taken people's political worldviews into account, then we can sort of say, oh, we recruited people and they were young and old and rich and poor and black and white and, you know, educated and less educated, and so it was a very diverse group, but actually we could end up with a very diverse group of left-leaning people, which is not the same thing. So then we'll end up with these sort of, you know, aggregated findings of things like citizens' assemblies saying, well, this is what the people want, and then actually there'll be pushback because the people weren't all in the room. And I think it's, to my mind, this is another slightly dangerous thing, which is, I think there is a strong tendency in the climate activism world, and it's partly why I left working for a charity that does climate work and went off to do a PhD, to sort of consider people that don't hold the same view as you as like somehow fundamentally wrong, or even as to go as far as say they're sort of evil, whereas actually these are just sort of different views. So if climate policy is always being framed in these very globalist, very sort of social justice, very transnational, you know, cooperating UN level kinds of things, that is fundamentally problematic for certain people's worldviews, whose the way they view their world is much more local, much more family. And if you're interested in this, there is a really fascinating paper by a guy called Waits. It's a big group of people, but Waits, W-A-Y-T-Z, where they did a thing looking at people's what they call moral circles. So they effectively said, it's almost like a bullseye diagram. There are thousands and thousands of people. You know, where do you put your care? Where is it important for you to care? And the bullseye starts with me and my family, and then my village and my town, my country, and so on. And it goes right out to all the rocks in the universe and everything in between, kind of thing. And essentially it breaks down along ideological lines. Those of a more right-leaning conservative worldview, the hot spot is in the middle. It's very local, it's very me, my family, my village kind of thing. Whereas the more kind of left-leaning view you have, the more likely you are to sort of try and put your care across literally the entire every rocks in the universe part of it. And so what that means is that we're talking at cross purposes. So when a left-leaning activist is talking about community organising, these words are like trigger words to some groups. And they're not hearing community, they're hearing a communist is coming to tell me what to do. And so I just think it's really, really important that we are, in these heightened times when we are all feeling, particularly if you've been involved in this for a long time, very anxious and very like, you know, we've got to keep going, is to not demonize other people for the very core values that they hold, but instead to say, how can I make the message that I have align with those values? And that is almost always possible in terms of climate. And as Nick said, you know, powers are at the wrong level. Local government needs to have an awful lot more power than it does. And those things, I think, would then make, you know, for example, just imagine a world where parish councils were tasked with a statutory duty to do something about climate change. That would change the narrative around it quite substantially in rural areas as well. But that power doesn't currently exist. So I think it's about, when we're talking about community, we have to accept that not all communities have the same values, and that rather than thinking of people as, you know, unpleasant or evil or whatever, we just need to think of them as different.
Thank you, really fascinating. And Scarlett, you've done a lot of work with younger people, which is perhaps a different demographic, perhaps not, but I mean, what's been your experience and what are the lessons around engaging people?
I think that the reason for lack of engagement is kind of related to what you've said, and it's a narrative problem. I know that when, again, like going back to school, whenever we learned about climate change, it was only about the science, about, you know, like the greenhouse effect, that sort of thing. It wasn't until I was a little bit older, and about 10, so not that much older, but I started learning more about politics, that I realised that actually like climate change was caused by people, and that these were all the different impacts it would have. It was why so many people, I'm from Birmingham, like in my class in Birmingham had asthma. It's because we lived in an area with really high air pollution. Or like it was why lots of people in my class had families who'd lost their homes to flooding and that sort of thing. And that like human element sort of kicked in, and that's because climate change is very often framed as a really sciencey thing. Like, I think when I got into climate activism, lots of my friends from home were quite shocked because I hate camping. I refuse to sleep on the ground. If I can sleep in a bed, I don't really like nature. Guys, I'm allergic to grass. Like, I'm allergic to pollen. It's not really my thing. And I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm a medical student. But I really care about the climate because the climate impacts people, and I like people. And I like nature. I don't like being in nature that much, but I like it being there. I know that other people want it to be there and like being in it, you know. And there's all these other things that it impacts that I care about. So there's so many links between climate and medicine. We know that the climate crisis is going to make zoonotic diseases, which are diseases where pathogens pass from animals to humans, more likely. We know that flooding is going to cause more waterborne diseases. We know there'll be more natural disasters. That sort of thing is what hooked me in. And every single subject is a climate subject, and that isn't translated in school. So I actually wrote a bill in 2019 called the Climate Education Bill with some of my friends and the MP Nadia Whittam, the MP for Nottingham East. And what that bill aims to do, and some of it has been partially implemented into legislation, is to integrate climate justice through every single subject and like weave it through like a golden thread. So that if you're in food tech, for example, you learn about food deserts that are caused by climate change and what that means, you know, like nutritionally, and how you kind of combat that. If you're drama in English, you learn about communicating about the climate crisis, because we're really bad at it, I think. It's so hooked on fear, and we can't do that. To hook people in to act, we need to center it on hope. We need to show that an alternative is possible, it is feasible. You know, learning about that, or like looking at texts from people who've survived a natural disaster. In maths, it's so easy to incorporate climate change. Like, you know, there's questions whether like this person bought 56 bananas, like what would happen if they did this? Just put in a graph that's actually a real one and make them analyze that instead. So I think one of the ways is by showing people how it's relevant to them, You know, for me, like being a Brummie who doesn't like nature, for me it was looking at the links with medicine or looking at the links with people in my local community where I'm from and seeing how I fit in with that. And then I think another thing as well is climate activism and organising in general is a very middle class dominated space. It's a very like white dominated space. It's a very female dominated space as well. So people don't all see themselves in that. So I also think we need to move away from the idea that just like people who glue themselves to things are climate activists, because I think it's also people who have community gardens, for example, like have a communal allotment. I think that's a form of climate activism. Or I think doctors and teachers and so many different professions, not just the ones who wear hard hats, are also doing climate activism because they're dealing with the impacts of climate change firsthand. So very rambly, but in summary, I think the way we engage more young people is showing them how it's relevant to their interests, to what they want to do, firstly. Secondly, making it accessible, whether that's through school councils or having like school initiatives. I worked with some schools in Bermuda a couple of years ago where they like built, the children there built robots to plant food that they then use in their schools, which I thought was so cool, as part of their DT lessons. And they also like built lunch boxes. So instead of having plastic every single day, they had these lunch boxes which they made themselves, which they take every day, and it massively, actually completely eliminated single-use plastic in all of the schools there. And like having other sort of initiatives like that, making it accessible, and third, showing people that climate activism isn't just like going on a protest. And I love a good protest, but there's other ways to do that too, other ways that people might find more palatable towards them.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nick, you think about this a lot. I know you started talking about community, but do you want to go a bit further? And
Yeah, I might just pull it back, just talk about values a little bit. And I was going to ask Rachel, so do you, and maybe you can answer or respond after I've just said, but a question that came to my mind, do you think the citizens' assemblies have therefore come to conclusions that are, it's not quite right, not fully representative, or don't represent absolutely everybody's views? I'd be really interested in the answer to that. And the reason why I say that is, about 15 years ago, we ran something that looked very close to what is now thought of as a citizens' assembly. It was quite a big research project. We had workshops in 6 locations of the country considering what the energy system should look like in the future. So we gave various scenarios, and people could decide whether how much nuclear power they needed, or how much reduction in flying they would be doing, etc. And they spent a day considering that. And at that time, we didn't select for politics, although you could, of course, as well as age, gender, you could select a group of citizens for research based upon their attitudes as well. You'd ask them to do a questionnaire, and then you would specifically pick some soft and hard conservatives and reform voters to do that. Anyway, I was always slightly puzzled because we knew there was a political dimension to all of this, but overall, our conclusions seemed to talk for the whole group, who clearly were there were 50 people across the country who'd taken part in this. But it's probably because the fundamental values that seemed to come out that people thought, well, this is where we should be going. The first one was they wanted an energy system where we didn't have loads of waste. And you can think of that as something that does cut across. You know, whether you're on the left or the right, waste is actually quite a bad thing. So people didn't like systems that were perpetuating waste. And the second one was, which is sort of linked to it, people consistently said, we're using the finite resources of the earth. And so, again, as a climate activist, you could rightly say, we don't want to be burning oil and gas because we're using up. And equally, you could come from a more right-wing position and look at, where are the minerals going to come from for the future, prosperity and things that we use. And those were the two things. And sitting below that then was a belief that we should have a sustainable future, that the past had not been great, and that cut across the groups. And that, therefore, if you could find the right path that met some of those values, amongst a number of other things as well. I think the local was really important as well. Again, if you're if you're having a conversation with people more on the soft right, then I think it's been known for a long time that local environmental protection is something that they really care about. So there was a criticism many years ago of the theory of environmentalism, which had 4 types, and it's kind of put environmentalism in this very kind of left-wing, very justice-oriented, internationalist box. And then this was a woman called Mary Douglas, who must have been a fellow of the Academy. She was a famous anthropologist at University College London. And their theory was criticised because it was pointed out that conservative voting people, rural people, and others were all members of the National Trust and cared deeply about animals, wildlife, and the heritage of the country. So there was something that was, missing in that simplification of environmentalism. So where's the shared environmentalism? And that's a slightly idealistic thing to say. And maybe Rachel will say it's no longer possible. I don't know. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, do you want to come in on?
Yeah, so in terms of the citizens' assemblies that have happened, no, I don't think that they've come up with stuff that is just so toxic that half the country won't agree with it, not at all. But I do think that there is a sense that they potentially won't have the traction that they could have because of this issue that certain demographics were maybe not in the room. And I think that part of that comes from what I was saying around the very culture that underpins deliberative democracy is itself broadly underpinned by some left-leaning things. So what you'll notice is that a lot of these citizens' assemblies, they come out with recommendations. And so someone who was in my research team, Alfie Shepherd, his thesis was on, well, why don't we take all 50 of those and we'll have a look at them and see if there are the joint recommendations. And so I can tell you, for example, that 87% of them want a public communications campaign that ties it, and 70% of them want a transport campaign to try and get people out of their cars, and 60% of them want a campaign on, want the government to have net zero new builds and all that kind of thing. But the way that they work is to get people to vote on recommendations at the end, and that means that the fundamental philosophy underpinning them is consensus. And where a consensus can't be found is just sort of, we couldn't get people to agree on this one. And so there's a lot of stuff out there in the theory around a concept called agonism. So antagonism is kind of, we're just fighting with each other about this. Agonism is a sort of more civilized approach, which is a sort of, why can't we all be honest about the fact that we don't share the same values, and find a way to sort of surface those values and talk about them instead of pretending that we can find consensus. And so if we think about conservatism and we wonder about, your National Trust example is brilliant. So one of the fundamental underpinnings of conservatism is that they see, conservatives see the world as a contract, effectively, between the living, the dead, and those who are yet to be born. And so the ideas that underpin conservatism are about taking the wisdom of the past and taking what has been left to us. And Edmund Burke, who's one of the sort of the father of conservatism, his thinking was very much around radical change. That if you change things very radically, quite often what you will create are other problems. And if you look at one of his most famous writings is on the French Revolution, and you would think that he wrote it after the revolution, after the worst of it, but he didn't. He wrote it before, just when it was starting, and he was predicting what would happen, the terror and all of the violence and the breakdown in social structures that occurred during the French Revolution, from his sort of conservative worldview. So finding ways, I think, and conservatives actually were kind of ahead of the game in terms of, when you think back to Margaret Thatcher, and the Labour Party were nowhere on the environment issues back in the 70s and 80s. It was very much a conservative thing because it was about looking after the legacy of what we've been left. We are just merely stewards at this moment is kind of central to conservative thought. And I think there are some politicians that I don't think they really stand for that. But so I just do think it's about saying, how can we, it's not possible to flatten people's values out. It's not possible to get people to come over to the other side. I think conservatism and liberalism, if you want to break it down that way, are like yin and yang. Too much conservatism leads to sclerosis. Too much progressivism leads to destruction, and they're there to sort of balance each other out. And I think if we were more able to sit in rooms together as people, at community level, in citizens' assemblies, and really surface that agonism and really challenge each other and talk about why those values are important to us, I think we would get further. And there is a really great thinker on deliberative democracy called Christina Lafont, who is sort of simultaneously quite critical of citizens' assemblies, but also a massive fan of them. And her view is that they should be like juries. It should be like jury duty. There should be constant citizens' assemblies on policy all the time. Everyone you know should have done one. And they should be kind of much more, rather than well, what should we do about climate change, to the people of Swindon, it should be, what should we do about retrofit? What should we do about education policy? And very policy-specific things where people can come together and talk about practical things that have practical outcomes, whether that's about river pollution, whether that's about biodiversity net gain, whether that's about climate, whether that's about retrofitting buildings, whatever it would be. So, but keeping that agonistic understanding at the heart of it, that it's not about flattening values and making people come to an agreement that they never will.
Thank you, really fascinating. Now, I've got one last cluster of questions and then we'll come to you, so do start thinking about what you might want to ask our panel. But the whole set of questions around the relationship between environment and equity or equality. And I wonder, Scarlett, whether you might start us off on your thoughts about this. I gave the example from the ONS data about the fact that people are saying, well, one reason I don't do it is it costs too much. So even in the UK, there's an element of that. But there are also international implications. So I don't know what your thinking is on this area.
I think the climate crisis is a crisis that is born out of inequality and inequity. We know that the countries that contribute the least to the climate crisis are going to pay the biggest price for it because they're more geographically vulnerable, and they've also been made economically stable by colonialism and by past events. And I think it is true that we haven't really seen a shift in that. I know last year at COP, it was the first COP where loss and damage was ever even discussed, which was a huge win, but it is true that we're not going far enough, fast enough. And even in the UK itself, what people ask, with this conversation, I feel like people always end up talking about the so-called global south and don't talk about the UK, but we are still being impacted by the climate crisis here in the UK, and the people who are impacted by the climate crisis are increasingly poorer. They're from working class communities, they're from marginalised communities, they're disabled. We saw that, in the summer with the people who are, suffering from heat-related illnesses, heat stroke, that sort of thing. They're more vulnerable, they're older, often they're poorer. And now, going into the winter, our winters are getting colder as well as the summers getting hotter. The people who are going to, we always hear about the NHS winter flu crisis. The people who are going to be hit the hardest by that are going to be people who can't afford to pay for their heating. And the reason their heating is so expensive is because we're reliant on fossil fuels. If we had renewable energy, we know that would be cheaper. That's a problem of inequity in itself. And if we look at flooding over the weekend, for example, the people impacted by that flooding are from more working class communities. So I think if the question is how do we make this more equitable, we need to centre those voices in this decision making. And by that, I don't mean have a consultation once and then get loads of Russell Group grad policy makers to go ahead and take that forward, but actually have co-creation, collaborative policy, collaborative community initiatives, collaborative approaches that are truly that. They're not tokenistic, but actually they're fully integrative. We can't make solutions for people if we don't know what it is that they want and need. I think that's really important on a sort of international, national level when it comes to policy. And then I think another thing is that it is true that buying food that is less plastic heavy, for example, is more expensive, or buying organic is more expensive. That is true. And with that, it's kind of a do what you can situation. I don't think we should be purist about how good of a climate activist someone is, or not even an activist, but person who's conscientious and cares about the planet is. Doing as much as you can is better than doing nothing at all. Lots of my friends often tell me they wish they could be vegetarian, but they really like cheese. But no one's stopping you from doing that. You can just be vegetarian and still have cheese. That's good. That's a lot better than carrying on as normal because you don't want to give one thing up, for example. I think we need to be a lot more relaxed about that and just do what we can, essentially.
As a vegetarian, I must say that the worst thing vegans have done is bring us vegan cheese.
I just realised I said vegetarian. I meant vegan, guys.
Yeah, no, we got that, I think. Rachel, this question of equity is quite interesting from the work you've been doing around values. And equity is sometimes seen as the kind of woke bit of all of this. Is there a way of framing some of this in a way that works with some of the audiences you've been looking at?
Yeah.
Don't feel restricted to just that.
Yeah, I think there's a definite, again, a language thing that's underpinned by values. So there's a difference between fairness and justice to a lot of people. And I think that, particularly on the political right, thinking about how we frame climate policy so that it seems fair. And one of the things that is a real bugbear and a thing that sort of makes people dig their heels in on that side of the political spectrum is if you are living, you know, on a council estate in Rotherham or Wolverhampton or somewhere like that, and you're a very low income household, and you're, you know, busily trying to make ends meet, and then you're simultaneously being told it's entirely your fault that the Maldives is disappearing under the sea, you feel quite put upon, this idea that you're somehow this privileged person living the life that you think is extremely hard. It feels very unfair to people. So that kind of constant globalist messaging can be quite counterproductive. But I think there's, you know, thinking about this as a sort of local people power thing, one of the things, I do a lot of training with local government, both parishes and districts and counties and everything, and something that people, when you have workshops with people, something that people love to talk about is trees, unlike you. Loads of people like nature, as it turns out. They really like trees, and trees is an area where there isn't equality and fairness, because you only have to look at where all the trees are, and then look at in urban areas, and then look at who lives there. And basically, the more heavily treed a neighbourhood is, the wealthier it will be. And one of the I think most effective things we could be doing, particularly from a climate adaptation point of view, although trees obviously are a carbon store, but it wouldn't necessarily be for mitigation purposes, is to think about how we can re-tree Britain. You know, we do have very low tree cover in most of our urban areas. It's recommended that we have 20% tree cover in every kind of urban ward. I was up in Blackpool running training there a few weeks ago. Not one of their wards has more than 6 or 7% tree cover. Some of them have 0.5% tree cover, you know, and these are areas then, if we're getting heat waves, we're having areas where the temperature of the road, the temperature of a car, the temperature of the walls in a street with no trees will be up at more than 40 degrees, whereas a street with trees 2 or 3 streets away, the same day, same weather, will be, you know, low, mid-20s. And then that have massive, massive knock-on impacts on people's health, as you pointed out. But then we come up against something, because obviously where do we want to plant those trees? We want to plant them on those streets. What do we also keep on those streets? All the cars that we park on the street. Why do we have all those cars? Because we haven't properly funded public and active travel. And so, because trees, a bit like the National Trust sort of thing, everyone loves a tree, it's a good place to start a conversation. You know, you can have that conversation about fairness. You can have that conversation about why is it that the poorer the area, the fewer the trees. You can have that conversation about the fact that the richer the person, the bigger the car, therefore the more space they take up when they park it on the side of the road. And you can have conversations about how do we make our places more beautiful. And then that you can start tapping into conservative values again. You know, if you're interested in familiarising yourself with conservative thought, I can recommend reading the works of Roger Scruton, who not only has interesting things to say, but also writes very beautifully. But the work that he did on beauty in the public realm and beauty in streets and so on, you can so easily tie that together with re-greening urban environments, but make it speak to very conservative values. And I think that would be a really, at a community level, thinking about how we bring together tree planting, and how that immediately then makes us think about how we use road space, which then allows us to talk about how we move ourselves around. It's just so much of what we need to do to tackle the climate crisis is what we should be doing anyway in local government. We want healthier people who are moving more, who are eating less meat, who are living in warmer homes that aren't mouldy in the winter and aren't overheating in the summer. Like, we actually want that for people anyway. Even if the climate crisis wasn't happening, we would want healthy, happy people eating healthy diets, living in nice homes. So why don't we just frame it around that?
Very interesting. Roger Scruton, another fellow of the British Academy. We hold multitudes here. Nick, what's your view? And I mean, this may not be one for you, but I did want to flag one of the questions in this area was looking at the kind of concept of waste colonialism. You know, are we doing well on our waste because we're sending it all overseas? You may or may not want to pick that up, but...
It's well, I was going to come back to the trees, but I suppose you know, there's a lot of discussion about what a circular economy will look like. And I'm not an economist, but I've done a bit of work on consumption And a lot of people are trying to work out how we can kind of contain waste within the country in a way that deals with it appropriately, that doesn't affect the environment, and we're not just exporting it to other countries, which would clearly be unjust and clearly happens currently. So, I mean, I think more work needs to be done around that question. It's a lot of change. It's not, people are very good at actually recycling because they see it's an important thing for the environment, but it's what then happens to the waste once it's gone into the recycling centre in the local council or wherever that actually matters. So I think, you know, trying to get more circularity, I don't really want to frame it as a national thing, but it is in a way, because you don't want to be an extra burden on Africa or on another part of the world that is much lower income than us and has got other climate impacts bearing down on it. I just wanted to come back to the trees, though, because they kind of show the justice point. Coming from Wales, I'll tell you about the tree policy in Wales, which some of you may have noticed in the news. Our former First Minister came up with a great idea that all farms should have 10% of trees on them. And they've had to change the policy, huge kickback from farmers, not happy about it. Quite rightly, because had the government listened a bit more carefully to what some of the farmers were saying, not every farm is suitable for 10% of trees. It should really be 100% producing food. Some farms already have the 10% of trees. So I think there's a point, the fairness and the public engagement, citizen engagement, is about trying to understand the conditions under which it would be acceptable to find 10% of the land area of Wales under tree cover, which is probably what's required. And you can't just mandate it from the top. So I think that's where, and that's less about values, it's more about local knowledges and respecting local knowledges. It does actually relate to your question, because I think the, you know, waste in the global south and being in, you know, from the global north is partly about local knowledge and local culture and trying to respect that. And if we tried a bit harder on that one as well, I think we would understand what things probably need to change in this so-called circular economy if we can get there. Sorry, that was a bit of a roundabout.
No, very good. Really.
But everybody does, everybody loves trees. Strangely enough, when we do deliberative work, I'll finish, and we're trying to get people to think about carbon removal, and there are multiple, so agriculture's got a bit of a problem. It's hard to decarbonise. We may not even reach it by 2050 for agriculture as a sector. So there's a lot of discussion about land use change. And there are multiple ways in which you might change the use of land, both with food production and some without food production, which would help with some of the carbon removal. And when we do research, the moment you pitch trees into a set of options, reforestation, people will go for that. And actually the Climate Assembly UK kind of concluded we should have lots of more trees. And I know people in policy looked at that and thought, but they were presented with a lot of other options that we're working on and that a lot of money is going into. Why did they not go with these other options? And so in these debates, certain things have quite powerful framing effects. I think that, so that as a social scientist, when we're trying to do research on public attitudes, it's not that we try to avoid putting them in ourselves and saying this is the way to think about it. The moment people come up with it in our workshops or focus groups, that's fine. Let's have a conversation about trees. But I think that's one of the interesting shape questions that social scientists wrestle with, is trying to understand what the public sentiment or mood or set of textures are without imposing your own frame of reference on it. And that's hard.
Definitely is. The trees research is fascinating, and if Rachel Reeves is here, maybe she'll put 2 pence on income tax but fund a tree for everyone, and maybe that'll get it through. Who knows? Right, turning to you now, the audience, those of you online and those of you in the building, we'll open up for some questions. I'll take a few at a time. Put your hand up in the traditional way. Well, it's a very friendly panel, and don't feel constrained by what we've already talked about. Please. There's a mic coming, so if you just hold on a second.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
I was going to ask if there was any charities or organizations that you guys feel has been taking a good stance in environmental actions, or just something that you would want to bring like attention to, like you personally?
That's a great question, thank you. Others, I encourage you. Yes, with another person at the front, we're making our team get their steps in.
I'll just frame the question first.
Please.
So, to some extent, you could look at the climate question as a relatively simple one. It's getting the carbon cycle back into balance, similar to the ozone layer issue. Sustainability is a much more complex one. And we could simplify it in the suggesting that people are out of balance with nature. We've long, since the Industrial Revolution, etc., seen agricultural revolution, seen ourselves as on top of or outside of nature. The question is, how do we come back into seeing ourselves as part of nature?
Well, that's a great question, and we've got one more over here, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Hi. I was going to sort of open question about, kind of inspired by your picture here, but thinking about how to use heritage, things that people are already familiar with. So allotments could be a good example, where people are engaged in food produce and have been for a long time. There's a lovely tradition of that, and people of different parts of life coming together. So I think that could be potentially a way forward, and touch on what you were talking about trees as well. As you say, it's something people are already familiar with. So using that as a base, that it's not something new. We have had some, the past to think about the future.
Great, really interesting set of questions. So who's doing some good work in whatever sphere that you might point to? I'll just go through all three and then come back to you. How do we humans feel properly part of the environment? In a way, how do we frame sustainability in a way that makes some sense to all of us, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly? And then is heritage something that we could build upon? Allotments was given as an example, but there may be others. Nick, you would look like you wanted to come in and take any of those or all of those three as you like.
Just on the charity, there's a very good group in Oxford called Climate Outreach. They've got a big website, and they've got lots of resources on communicating about climate change for all sorts of audiences. They do good research as well, so that would be my one that, as a researcher, I would go to.
Very good. Do you want to pick up on any of the other questions?
Well, yeah, the point about people are doing other stuff or embedding sustainability into everyday life. One of I'm part of something called the UK Energy Research Centre, which is funded through the research councils, and they have something called a Public Engagement Observatory, and that has been looking at all the different examples of not just citizen examples, but they've looked at a lot of the citizen examples of how local communities, groups, councils, and others have got engaged with sustainable energy, basically, and the energy transition. And it's incredible. There are, across the UK, lots of really good examples. So I think and their argument would be in UEA, University of East Anglia, where they host this observatory, this bottom-up drive for sustainability is something we haven't yet properly harnessed. And we can talk, the citizens' assemblies are sort of, some occur because there's a bottom-up push. But equally, the big ones have sort of been a top-down thing that's come from Parliament or government or elsewhere. And I think the argument is there's stuff going on which really needs to be connected. Community energy schemes are a good one. They won't solve the whole of the problem, but they will bring sustainable energy very closely in. And there's one or two good examples. Communities have had. Some of you will have heard of the thing called fracking, which has not occurred. And communities who have had the potential threat of that, get very skilled in understanding what it's all about, and often then start organising to do other stuff, which might be bringing renewable energy in, etc. So there's a kind of a trigger thing as well that goes on sometimes.
Very good. Rachel?
That was perfect, because I was going to say community energy. So, yeah, I would second the climate outreach, not least because a huge amount of their work is about segmenting the population by its values. and recognising that everybody doesn't think the same. But I was going to say, in response to your question about community energy, more broadly, so there are lots of, there is a national sort of trade body, if you want to call it that now, called Community Energy England, that's been going around a decade, which sort of represents all of these grassroots groups who own and run community-based energy projects, which largely started as renewables. They're, community-owned wind farms and solar farms and hydro plants and that sort of thing. But over time, the sector has matured, and there is a lot of really exciting work happening in that space. One that I would really recommend looking at is the Low Carbon Hub in Oxford, which operates across Oxfordshire and does lots of work around not only community-owned solar, and they've got this idea of something called the People's Power Station, whereby across Oxfordshire you would have lots of little solar arrays and hydro and whatever going on, and it's all sort of connected together so that communities across Oxfordshire between them own a power station, as it were. It's just made up of lots of little things, but they've done some fascinating work with flexibility work, so how communities can bring their the national grid needs the most extraordinary amount of upgrading. We haven't seen this level of upgrading needed since probably the end of the Second World War. And one of the things that would make it a lot easier is if we didn't have to max for maximum capacity. So if people can flex their demand and use community-based approaches to do that, then there could be ways for communities not only to reduce carbon footprints, but also literally earn money from not using electricity when it's more expensive to make. So I'd really recommend looking into community energy. The other question that was asked around heritage, I think that again is a really interesting and useful question, because particularly thinking about that conservative worldview around stewarding what was left to us from the past so that we can hand it on to the future. We're only temporary stewards of whatever we have at the moment. That's true of the countryside, but it's also true of buildings. And one of the things about it is that conservatism isn't just conserve this and don't ever change anything. It's about stewarding and in some cases improving. And there's a fascinating university in Hereford. Most people have never been to Hereford and know nothing about it. And there's a university there called NMIT, the New Mechanical Institute of Technology and Engineering, who run courses on sustainable timber construction. And the idea being that, how do we build the vernacular of the future? In 100 years, who will be looking back and saying, look at these beautiful old houses that are entirely made of timber that were built in this sustainable way? It's how, again, speaking to those values of aesthetics and beauty and so on, that the reason we value our built heritage, we don't value the ugly stuff necessarily. We value the stuff that we feel had that thought and care put into it. And so the courses that they're running at NMIT, I believe Edinburgh University runs a similar thing. It's about heritage skills, it's about sustainable building, it's about reusable materials, it's about building buildings that can be deconstructed rather than demolished. So if in 100 years you didn't need it, you could take it apart again and all the bits could be reused, all those kinds of things. So I think heritage is actually an incredibly useful angle for because if you want people to think about the future, one of the ways you can get them to think about it is to think about, when our present is somebody else's past. Because that will trigger their kind of national trust gene to kick in.
Thank you. Scarlett?
I think there are so many charities and organisations that are doing some good work. So like a plug of myself, but Teach the Future, I think we're really cool. Student-led campaign to reform the education system and decarbonise it. And that's part of SOS UK, which is a charity that has loads and loads of different campaigns all around sustainability. Really like them. Tipping Point, I think, also is a really cool organisation. They work all across the UK and have lots of different projects going on. I also like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. They do more policy-focused things. A fun one is Climate Live. They work at the intersection of music and climate, which is really cool. They go to concerts and festivals trying to get more young people engaged in climate. There's so many other ones as well. And then the other two questions, I think I'm going to start with the heritage one first. So I think that's such a great question, and it's one that there's lots of examples to draw from. The two things that came to mind for me were in Bangladesh, this project of creating community floating gardens has been really successful in engaging people. And in Samoa, restoring mangrove forests. Like, these are two very heritage-based projects, which you might not automatically think, oh, that's like doing great things for the climate, but it is, and it gets people connected with the lands, with where they're from, and it is actually has a massive effect. I feel like I went too hard on my nature hatred earlier. I take some of it back. I like some trees, so I can give you guys that. I don't like birch trees, but I like the other trees. So I do think that it's a good sort of route for people. Heritage and culture and the arts more generally, I think they're such powerful tools to connect with people and to connect with people and to ground people, especially in an age where we don't do that as much anymore. And then with the question about how we see ourselves more embedded in sustainability, I think one of the ways is we need to change climate messaging from being around loss to gain. One of the I think reform's biggest climate messaging is, like, these net zero policies are going to make your energy bills higher, or you're going to lose, like, your plastic straws. That already happened, but, like, I don't know. They just basically frame everything as you're going to lose all of these things. And instead, we need to shift that around and talk about gains instead. Actually, we know having, community-owned renewable energy means things are going to be cheaper. Having retrofitted houses that have good insulation also going to make things cheaper, and you're going to be warmer, and those sorts of things are nice, right? I think we need to change the narrative so it's less about what we're going to lose and more about what we're going to gain, and there are so many things that we are going to be able to gain. And another thing is really just talking to people and seeing what it is that they want and what they need. So I'm from Birmingham. I love Birmingham. We started the Industrial Revolution, though, in the West Midlands more widely. And we've still got a very industrial base. There's so many factories. And with the climate crisis, we need to just transition for workers. That includes fossil fuel workers. That includes workers who are in sectors that are very carbon heavy. We need to actually meet with those people and see what it is we can give them so that they can have this just, equitable future too. How do we give them the skills, resources and training needed so that they don't lose things in this climate transition, but instead gain better, green, well-paid, secure jobs?
Very good, thank you. Now I'm going to come back to the audience, and we've got a question, at least one from the online audience, so we'll start there.
We've got a couple of questions online, if that's okay. So 2 questions for Scarlett, first of all. What were the outcomes of the school climate strikes, and what role do you think protest can have in making real change to climate policy in the future? And the second question for Scarlett is, what's the current mood among students and young people in regard to the climate crisis? And then there's a more practical question for the whole panel. If you could recommend just one thing that each of us could do after leaving this event that could make us feel more empowered and feel like we're doing good for the planet, what would it be?
That's a great question. Now, can I just check if there's anything else anyone wants to raise in here? We'll take this last question here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hello. It's not a sort of straight question, but just one of the question I ask myself. At large, if we see there's enough resource online, it's enough talked about, what climate crisis is, what's happening. Even government, they've set up policies to tackle it. Businesses are going green. But at large, still we don't see, enough happening. So, what stops it from happening?
Okay. So we've got some big questions there. Scarlett, do you want to kick off? You've got questions specifically for you around school strike, protest, mood amongst young people. If you do that, and then we'll pick up these other ones.
Okay, so outcome of the climate strikes. I think it probably depends who you ask. If we talk in terms of material outcomes, the UK was declared a climate emergency. I think we were the first country actually globally to declare a climate emergency, and pretty much every council declared a climate emergency too. And then the criticism of that is there was no legislative underpinning there. So that whether that's a win or not is a massive debate, essentially. You could say yes, because it put climate on the agenda. You could say no, because policy didn't shift enough. I would say that I think that the climate strikes and other protests more generally did put climate back onto the agenda. I think they put them into the mainstream. Before the climate strikes and other protests in 2019, climate was a lot more of a fringe issue than it became. I don't think there was a single day during sort of 2019, 2020 where climate wasn't a headline. And that, I would say, maybe that's a bit narcissistic, but obviously I wasn't the only person protesting. That was a direct outcome of those protests. And I think protest in general has an enormous role in mobilizing people. I think it actually has a really big role in community too, right? Like if you feel really obsessed about something, it can be really isolating. Going out to a protest and seeing that hundreds or thousands or maybe millions of people agree with you, it's actually a really lovely feeling. It makes you feel less isolated. It makes you want to do more. It's a really good way to galvanize people. And I think that can't be understated. I think there's always going to be a role for protest. And as I've gone older and have been doing more policy work, I find myself being on protest less, but I still recognize how important it is as a mechanism of action. And actually, I think, it's quite scary right now because we're seeing all of these anti-protest laws being passed. I think that's actually a massive threat. I think it really does scare me. I think that we should be able to have the right to, protest things that we don't think are right, to be able to find those people who agree with us and to demonstrate that. I think it's really crucial to a democracy. But yeah, what's the current mood amongst young people? I think that's a really good question. So I think it probably depends. So I'm a medical student. Most medical students are not climate activists. I would say amongst my non-climatey friends, I think people are feeling quite apathetic. It feels like we had, the climate strikes caused some really positive shifts in the climate narrative, but also it caused lots of greenwashing, basically. And a few climate things feel like they were really overdone, mostly the things about individual responsibility. And I think it's kind of left people a bit drained, because the full conversation they weren't really part of it, or the full narrative wasn't there. And also we've seen so much neglect from this current government and the previous government in terms of climate. Things do seem quite hopeless, especially in the wider context of the world. But I would say that young people now are a lot more educated on climate than they were before, and I would say that's a win in itself. And actually, I feel like hope is more of a mainstream. I know I've just said everyone's depressed, but I would say hope is more of a mainstream concept now too amongst young people than it was a few years ago too.
Thank you. Very good. Now, we're tight on time, so I'm going to give you 40 seconds each, which is optimistic, but let's see how we do. There's two main questions. They're very big. What's stopping progress, and what's one thing we can do? Nick? Okay, well, actually, the stopping progress is difficult, but I think it's issue specific, it's person specific. So not every thing can be fixed by some of the individuals in this room. Those wider structures have to be dealt with. Now, having said that, one thing you can do at the end of this meeting, go away and compose a letter to your MP, because they do read what's in their bag. And if they get nothing from the public about climate change, they will think it's not important to you. But I'll add a second, and then I'll stop. The other one is think about transport options. It's the biggest sticky thing for the future. But you can do things. You can take a bit more public transport if you've got public transport available. You can think about maybe going to Paris on the train instead of that flight, that slightly easier flight. The big thing that will change your carbon footprint, which not all people can do and is difficult to get into, but if you plan it well, eventually try and live without a motor vehicle. That slashes your transport emissions overnight and by a huge amount. But it's difficult because you need to live near public transport, schools, be able to do all the things you need to do on public transport, or not via a vehicle, or using a hire car now and again. But it can be done. Sorry. Thank you. Very practical. Rachel.
So the what's stopping it happening thing, so I'm not talking globally here or anything about fossil fuel companies or anything like that. The fundamental thing that stops it happening is that most people don't have enough agency to do what needs to be done. You cannot expect low-income households to find £50,000. I had a report done for my home, and I need to spend £140,000 to get my house to passive house standards. And there is nobody more motivated to do it, but I don't have that money. And that comes from, it goes right around in a circle, and I've written this down before. Nick even said it comes down to political bravery. No politician can stand behind an enormous slug of money to pay for home retrofit and things like that if they aren't being told by people that that's what is needed. And the Climate Change Act, which was the first in the world, we were the first country to self-legislate, and it gets celebrated, and quite rightly so, but I think people don't recognise how incredibly fragile it was. It was a moment in time. It was a combination of David Cameron trying to detoxify the Conservative Party, a very, very high-profile campaign from Friends of the Earth that hit a particular zeitgeist, and it could fall. So the most important thing that you can do after this is write to your MP and write to your local councillors and commit to doing that regularly, not in a ranty, strident, mad way,
Squeeze you.
in a really sensible way. I want you to do something about this. If millions of people did that, then the budgets would come.
Brilliant, thank you. Scarlett.
What causes an action? I think like there's so many different things, but one thing is fossil fuel lobbyists. This year at COP, there were more delegates from fossil fuel corporations than any country. Like if they were a country, they'd be the biggest there, which is ridiculous. They shouldn't be there. And obviously loads of more things, but I think that's one of the big things. And then one thing to make you feel empowered, apart from writing to your MP, I think going and Googling how climate crisis would affect your job or the course you study or something, and then talking to 3 people at your workplace or uni or your family and friends, I think that would be a good thing.
Well, it's been a fantastic session. A few thoughts that I take away from this. Framing really matters. Thinking about values, so fairness, not always talking about justice. Talk about trees a lot. It seems to cut through to everybody. The kind of focus on communities as a real kind of key place to take action. But actually action doesn't always have to be about us as individuals. It could be political. So writing to your MP is also an action. So it's not that we're divorced as individuals from that kind of political thing. And maybe a final thought is relentless optimism, which is what you said. And if I could give you one thing to take away, I'm chair of a charity called Our World in Data, and one of the researchers there, Hannah Ritchie, has written a couple of great books, very data-based, but actually full of optimism about what we can do to tackle the environment. So that's my Christmas present recommendation to all of you. Now, please join me in thanking our panel and the organisers, and then let's retreat for a lovely drink in the next room. Thank you.